China is planning to create a blacklist of U.S. companies as a way of retaliation against U.S. sanctions placed on Chinese companies. We'll be explaining this. Also, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a speech exposing some of the Chinese Communist Party's programs to influence U.S. politicians. We're taking an in-depth look at what's actually happening. And it's now being revealed that Catholics in China are being persecuted regardless of whether they follow the real religion or the CCP's altered version of the religion under the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association. We'll be explaining this as well. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. The Chinese Communist Party is planning to create a blacklist of U.S. companies as a way of retaliating against U.S. sanctions placed on Chinese companies. The regime's Ministry of Commerce published an Unreliable Entity List, as they're calling it, on September 19th. It includes provisions that will be used in the blacklist. Now, among the points it's looking at, stated directly, are things that, quote, have endangered the national sovereignty, security, or development interests of China, and on suspending normal transactions, as it calls it, with any business organization, individual in China, so on, that the regime believes goes against normal market principles or damages its rights. Now, when the CCP talks about this, what do they really mean? When they say endangering national sovereignty, what they really mean is anything that goes against the CCP's interest in the One China policy, its, quote, sovereignty when it comes to its claims, for example, over Hong Kong, Taiwan, Inner Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, you name it. Anything that would damage the territorial interests of the CCP, that would fall in line with that. And so, for example, criticizing human rights abuses in Tibet, or criticizing human rights abuses in Xinjiang, or, for example, standing up for democracy in Hong Kong. All of these would fall under that designation. This is the CCP's way of framing that. And when the CCP talks about suspending normal transactions, what do they mean here? Well, this means ending any deal with the Chinese Communist Party, entity, individual, so on regards of, say, for example, if a company is concerned about human rights abuses and it ends a deal because of it. Well, the CCP could say, for example, that this goes against the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. We do not recognize this as a legitimate reason to cancel this deal, and so you're going to be added to our list of bad guys when it comes to this blacklist. The Chinese Communist Party is putting together this blacklist to try to make different companies around the world fall in line with its own internal policies. But this ties into something bigger. In China, under the Chinese Communist Party, they have a concept when it comes to doing businesses with outside countries. When it comes to, for example, U.S. businesses operating in China, what do they call them? They call them sparring partners. The idea is this: they will train with these companies. If they're able to operate in China, they're regarded as sparring partners. They are training with them. They are learning from them. And as soon as the CCP no longer needs them, they kick them out of the country. We can look at some of the examples of this. Different companies try to get into China. Sometimes they're not allowed in. Sometimes they're allowed partially in. The Chinese Communist Party creates its own version of what they're doing. For example, they have copies of Uber. For example, they have copies of Google when it comes to, for example, Baidu. The Chinese Communist Party will only allow Western companies into the country if, for example, they're small businesses, they serve national interests somehow, or the Chinese Communist Party cannot currently replace them. Once it can replace them, it regards them as interference with its own internal interests, its own state-run companies. It kicks them out when it no longer needs them. The exception to that, a lot of the companies still doing business there, are ones that work, for example, in import-export, buying Chinese goods, using Chinese factories, and so on. Or, for example, companies that work so closely with the regime anyway that the CCP views their presence in China as being more valuable than replacing them. A blacklist like this for the Chinese Communist Party would not serve their interests because, again, any company currently operating there is there for a reason. The CCP is allowing them to be there currently because it serves the interests of the CCP. In other words, the CCP benefits more from their being there than it would them kicking them out. So this blacklist very likely is just going to harm the CCP's interests anyway. In other news, Tesla is suing the U.S. government and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer for tariffs placed on parts that it imports from China. Tesla wants tariffs made void, and it also wants money Tesla paid to be refunded and with interest. Now, Tesla was impacted by 2 rounds of tariffs on the CCP. According to CNBC, one batch that went into effect in 2018 put 25% duties on about $200 billion worth of imports from China. The second batch of these tariffs went into effect in 2019 and put a 7.5% tariff on about $120 billion of imports from China. Now, what are we seeing here? We'll likely see a boom in the electric car industry. This ties to two different elements. California Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order that will ban the sale of gas-powered cars by 2035. Again, it's controversial, but hear me out. And also, CCP leader Xi Jinping is saying China will go carbon neutral by 2060. Now, we'll have to see how close the CCP sticks to that goal, whether they actually honor it. We'll have to see whether Newsom's executive order actually stands. But regardless, the Chinese Communist Party will likely be interested in controlling the electric car market. They see this as the future. And their own narratives, they have a saying, surpass you at the turning point. They look at next generation technologies. And Tesla in this will likely be a huge target. And if they're importing parts from China, Tesla buying parts from China, this keeps at least some of the manufacturing and knowledge of the parts on the Chinese side of the market. Meaning this, if Tesla is manufacturing these parts in China, it means China has the know-how on manufacturing them if they're buying those parts. And even in addition to this, China knows the parts being sold to Tesla. There may, for example, be things that they're not, say, disclosing when it comes to making sure that other companies can't copy what they're doing. The CCP would have that knowledge if the parts are coming from China and in terms of how they're being used. Also, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a speech in Wisconsin on September 23rd where he exposed some of the Chinese Communist Party's programs to influence U.S. politicians. He also revealed the State Department is reviewing the activities of two CCP organizations involved in these operations in the United States under the regime's United Front Work Department. Specifically, these are the U.S. China Friendship Association and the China Council for the Promotion of Peaceful Reunification. Now, among the cases of CCP political interference that he noted directly was one from 2017. Pompeo said this.
But we watch these CCP campaigns targeting state-level officials, local interests. We've seen them at PTA meetings. They've been in full swing for years, and they're increasing in intensity. Much of that activity revolves around pressing state governments not to recognize, trade with, or otherwise engage with Taiwan. But that's not all. I'll give another example, and I could give many. In 2017, a California state senator proposed a bill merely expressing support for the Falun Gong practitioners in America and in China. It was oratory. It was a rhetorical resolution. These people that he was speaking to have suffered as tremendously under the Chinese Communist Party's crackdowns on religious freedom as any others.
In a response, Pompeo said, the Chinese consulate, that is, Chinese diplomats in San Francisco, responded by writing a letter to the state legislature.
The Chinese consulate, that is, Chinese diplomats, in San Francisco responded by writing a letter to the state legislature. It denounced the Falun Gong as an evil cult and claimed that the bill might deeply damage the cooperative relations between the state of California and China and seriously hurt the feeling of Chinese people in the vast Chinese community inside of California. Unfortunately, the California State Senate bowed to the CCP pressure and shelved the proposed bill. It's just one example. The reality is that most every state legislature in the country has probably received a letter from the CCP, much like Senator Roth's email, as part of a coordinated propaganda campaign.
Now, Pompeo noted that CCP influence and espionage campaigns don't just target the high levels of government. They also target municipal and city levels. He noted the Tibetan police officer with the NYPD, who is now facing charges in New York for acting as an agent of the CCP.
Then there's the next level down. CCP influence and espionage campaigns at the municipal and city levels. Just this week, you would have read in the papers, the Department of Justice charged a New York Police Department officer, an Army reservist, with allegedly acting as an illegal agent of China. He's accused of reporting on the activities of Tibetans living in the United States back to the Chinese Communist Party. How telling. He even provided CCP officials with access to senior-level NYPD personnel through invitations to official events. Sound familiar to anyone? He told his handler that officials in Beijing, quote, should be happy because you've stretched your reach into the police, end of quote. And we see it all over. We see it all over in America's sister city programs like the ones in Door County, La Crosse, Milwaukee, and Richland Center. They fall under the authority of something called the Chinese People's Association of Friendship with Foreign Countries. Sounds benign. But that group is part of China's United Front Work Department, the CCP's official overseas propaganda tool. It's one of the CCP's 3 magic weapons, in the words of Chairman Mao, along with armed struggle and party building. In other words, it may have friendly in its title, but it is not so when it comes to American interests.
Now, what are we seeing here? Those of you who watch the show regularly probably know that one of my jobs is an investigative reporter with the Epoch Times. I'm the senior investigative reporter there. Now, a lot of my work at the Epoch Times has been investigating operations exactly like this. In fact, the United Front Work Department directly. Going back to 2008 with the Epoch Times, a lot of my investigative work up until about 2012 was doing on-the-ground investigations into the CCP's United Front work in New York City. They, for example, worked with the Chinese consulates. The Chinese consulates then approached the different fraternal organizations, the Tongs, these front organizations, these friendship associations, as Pompeo notes. These organizations then work as the unofficial governing bodies of Chinese communities. They monitor the Chinese people, and they also work directly on influencing local politics, local police, local business. They also control the mafia, the Chinese mafia or the triads. One of the biggest of these organizations in New York, for example, is the Fujian American Association, one of the CCP's main hubs for these operations in New York City. Under the Fujian American Association is the Fuqing Gang, one of the largest transnational organized crime groups in the world. Human traffickers, drug traffickers, you name it. They're famous, for example, for the Golden Venture, which was a human trafficking ship that ran aground off the coast of New York several years back. Many people on that boat died. And so these operations, they are large scale. They don't just target, again, high-level government as Pompeo exposed. They also target city council members. They also target local government meetings. They also target the police department, you name it. This is a very, very large issue. And speaking from my own experience, it's good to see the U.S. government is finally looking into it. Now, in other news, apps may soon be required to list their country of origin. Bipartisan legislation introduced by Senators Rick Scott and Catherine Cortez Masto aims to reduce concerns around user security by adding a layer of transparency on where the apps are from. Now, Rick Scott wrote on Twitter, quote, apps backed by our adversaries like TikTok and WeChat pose huge security risks. Knowing their country of origin is the first step to protecting Americans' data and security. Now, this App Act, as it's called, would require the Federal Trade Commission to ensure companies behind these apps reveal where they are developed and where data collected by the apps are being stored. Senator Mastro said in a statement, quote, as smartphones play a bigger role in Nevadans' everyday lives, consumers are increasingly sharing their personal data with unknown app developers, sometimes with companies in Russia, China, or elsewhere, that might share Nevadans' personal data with those governments. Now, what are we seeing here? A lot of different apps on your phones collect data. When you go to install them, for example, you get these alerts saying this can access your contact list, this can access your notes, this can access your audio recording, it can access your video recording. This one can access, for example, your location data. This data is collected by these apps, and a lot of times they sell this data. The issue is, if the company, for example, can monitor your contact list, if it can monitor calls, if it can even record information like voice, video, so on, what happens to that data? Now, presumably, we assume it's being used for business interests. To an extent, we tolerate this, right? We know that, for example, some of the big social media apps collect data and sell it to advertisers, which is why, for example, if you're scrolling around and you're having a conversation about a certain product, you might see ads for that product on your phone. But the issue actually is a lot bigger than this. Different foreign hostile governments like the Chinese Communist Party are interested in your data exactly like this, because they can use it to monitor you, they can use it, for example, for economic espionage, they can use it to carry out human rights abuses, for example, monitoring Chinese expats and who they're affiliating with. And beyond this, there's also a bigger issue, one that's not being addressed in this act, which is that many of these tech companies also sell user data. In other words, a company can, for example, have no ties to the Chinese Communist Party. The, say, data center is in the United States. Everything is fine when it comes to that. But on their list of companies they sell that data to can be Chinese state-run companies, can be large Chinese tech companies based in China, and which the CCP would be able to get data from anyways. There are many different roads for the CCP to get this data. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first off, the Chinese Communist Party is increasing its policies of religious oppression. While the CCP's use of Muslim Uyghurs for slave labor has been in the headlines recently, the practice extends to other persecuted groups in China. A Reuters investigation found that the Chinese regime has been pushing Tibetans off their land and forcing them into military-style training centers where they learn factory jobs. It notes methods mirror what the regime has been doing in Xinjiang and practices that have been described as coercive labor. Reuters reviewed over 100 state media reports and policy documents and found the CCP has set quotas for the mass transfer of these laborers in Tibet and beyond. It also notes the regime has been rapidly expanding this program, and in just the first 7 months of 2020, over 500,000 people were trained in the project, and that accounts for about 15% of Tibet's population. Of those people, only around 50,000 were sent to jobs in Tibet, while the rest were sent to other parts of China. It notes as well they're often sent to low-paid jobs, working in things like textile manufacturing, construction, and so on. Now, when it comes to this, what the CCP has been doing in Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and Xinjiang is generally the same. The Chinese Communist Party is being accused of launching a program of cultural genocide. They are destroying these countries' cultures. The CCP conquered many of these areas by force. They're now going into them, destroying the traditional beliefs, the traditional cultures, taking people out of these areas and sending them to other parts of China. And also we now see issues of slave labor, forced labor through pressure. Now, in addition to this, Christians and Catholics in China aren't faring any better. The Vatican's controversial deal with the CCP from 2018 expires this month, and Bitter Winter reports priests in China are being threatened with even more restrictions if they refuse to join the Communist Party's state-run version of the religion that's under the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association. The deal between the Vatican and China from 2018 was brokered by the Vatican's Secretary of State, that was Pietro Cardinal Parolin, and allowed Pope Francis to recognize bishops approved by the Chinese Communist Party. Prior to that deal, the CCP had unofficial bishops in the country appointed under its own version of the religion, while the real bishops existed outside the CCP. The Vatican's move was criticized for potentially exposing Christians and Catholics in China to deeper persecution, as it legitimized the regime's altered version of the religions. And it's now being revealed, however, that Catholics in China are being persecuted whether or not they follow the CCP's approved version of the religion. That's again under the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association. They have similar organizations like this for other religions as well, like the China Buddha Association. Bitter Winter notes that even people at state-sanctioned churches are now facing threats and intimidation from the CCP. The regime is shutting down and destroying churches regardless. In Jiangsu province of China, just as an example, it notes that close to 550 Protestant venues have been shut down by authorities, and house Christians, including members of the Church of Almighty God, are facing new waves of arrest. Bitter Winter reports that close to 120 Church of Almighty God members were recently arrested by the CCP, and the regime is driving others to suicide. Other faiths in China aren't faring any better under the regime. Across the country right now, the CCP is destroying temples, smashing Buddha statues, sometimes even replacing them with idols of Communist Party leaders, such as Mao Zedong, and a growing trend of the regime, promoting cult worship of the party itself. Bitter Winter reports that in Shanxi, China, the regime destroyed a 1,000-year-old Tibetan Buddhist temple. In Sichuan, it recently destroyed or shut down more than 160 religious folk temples. The CCP is removing Buddha statues from temples and tourist sites, and religious believers who attempt to stop this, who try to stop the demolitions of temples, are being harassed and beaten by CCP police. Similar trends are taking place across China right now. Now, why does the CCP do this? They've been launching persecutions against religious believers since they came to power, since the Cultural Revolution and before that. The CCP cannot tolerate people believing in a power higher than the party. If people believe, for example, in traditional morality, then it means they have standards outside the CCP, and they can use those standards to judge whether what the CCP does is moral. The Chinese Communist Party wants what it calls political correctness. That's 1967 Mao Zedong. The idea is this: the bar of what is good or evil, what is right or wrong, is set by the party. If the party's actions are always right, if everything it does is what's considered right, and if you say otherwise, you are politically incorrect and can be persecuted, then morality is dictated by the party state, not by traditional values. Because of this, the Chinese Communist Party views religions as one of its main targets for annihilation. Also in some U.S. news, President Donald Trump signed an executive order on September 22nd to stop funding to federal government contractors who hold critical race theory training sessions. A White House statement says this is to, quote, promote unity in the federal workforce, the uniformed services, and among federal contractors by, quote, combating harmful and offensive race and sex stereotyping and scapegoating. It notes this will, quote, prohibit federal agencies and federal contractors from conducting training that promotes race stereotyping, for example, by portraying certain races as oppressors by virtue of their birth. The White House notes these trainings created a divisive ideology within federal agencies. As an example of this, it notes the Department of Treasury had instructed employees on one side to avoid narratives that Americans should be, quote, more colorblind, while simultaneously telling them that, quote, virtually all white people, regardless of how woke they are, contribute to racism. Now, what's happening in the United States with these things? People have compared this to what happened in China during the Cultural Revolution, when, for example, speaking out against the CCP, when, for example, speaking out against the moral trends, the destruction of traditional culture, if you did so, you would be criticized, you'd be attacked. People were taken out and publicly humiliated. Very similar to what's happening now with targets on race narratives and gender narratives. Now, also on this, when it comes to critical race theory, a lot of this goes back to the Frankfurt School. It was a Marxist school of studies that was brought to the United States. One of the ideas of that was critical theory. Critical race theory is an offshoot of that. And basically what it does is it takes the idea of the bourgeois and the proletariat, the communist idea of class struggle, and brings it to the entire sphere of race and gender. Now, the Department of Justice and Europol, meanwhile, carried out a joint international operation to take down a Darknet drug ring. This is pretty significant. Now, the takedown was codenamed Operation Disrupt Tor, Tor being the specialized system you need to access parts of the Darknet. And it resulted in over 170 arrests around the world, the seizure of around 274 kilograms of drugs, including fentanyl and others, and around 63 firearms, as well as over $6.5 million in cash and digital currencies. The operation hit some of the largest Darknet marketplaces, including Alphabet, Dream, Wall Street Nightmare, Empire, White House, Deep Sea, Dark Market, and others. The Department of Justice notes that several investigations are still ongoing as they work to identify more individuals linked to these Darknet web accounts. The FBI released footage from a search done as part of the operation. It notes that, quote, Darknet drug dealers believe they can operate anonymously on the fringes of the internet, and that, quote, operations like this show how the FBI and partner agencies are finding Darknet drug dealers and holding them accountable. According to the CDC, more than 31,000 people died from overdoses of synthetic opioids in 2018 alone, and that doesn't even count methadone. And fentanyl is among one of the more popular of these drugs. It also happens that most fentanyl comes from China, along with most other synthetic drugs and even precursor chemicals used by cartels to manufacture the drugs being sold in the United States and on the Darknet. On July 17th, the United States Department of Treasury designated 4 Chinese nationals and a Chinese company under its Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act for being a key supplier in the synthetic drug market. Now, that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also, if you want to support us, please consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find a link to our Patreon page in the description below.